and both IIASA and the Austrian Academy of Sciences are well-engaged members of the Council. COVID highlights our challenge. On one hand, science has become much more critical to both national and global decision-making than ever before, but on the other, it's highlighted the multiple problems of the science, policy, politics interfaces at both the national and multilateral levels. It demonstrates the challenge of nationalism in the face of a global crisis. It highlights the consequences of denial of evidence-informed assessment of high-impact risks. Despite scientific warnings, most countries, and indeed the international community, were not well prepared for the inevitability of a viral pandemic. We've seen anti-scientism move from a marginalized activity to one embedded in partisan politics and hyper-fueled by the digital milieu and the disinformation engines it creates. Anti-vaccine, climate change denial, anti-scientism, nationalism, and individualism all compete against the need for a collective approach to evidence-informed understandings and actions on the existential threats we face. This project, which Albert introduced, had an enormous number of people involved in contributing to it. And let me also add my acknowledgement of those of Albert to those who've contributed. It's been an enormous effort, particularly by the authors of the 3 reports and 2 summary statements shown on this slide, supported by many experts. It's had a most active and involved advisory board chaired by Mary Robinson. And I particularly want to acknowledge the leadership teams at both IIASA and at ISC for driving this project forward. I'm caught in a dilemma. I could spend the next 30 minutes just listing the broad range of recommendations and conclusions from these 3 reports, or focus on a few issues that I think merit particular consideration. I've chosen to do the latter and primarily address the issues of the changing nature of science, the use of evidence and risk assessment in public policy, and importantly, given that we're in Vienna, at least virtually, the diplomatic considerations. With this audience, I need say nothing about the urgency and timeliness of using the inflection point created by COVID to accelerate thinking and action on progress towards sustainability. Early in the pandemic, the mantra "Build Back Better" was used frequently. But as the pandemic extends into its second, and by no means last year, the enthusiasm for change is at risk of being replaced by a wish to return to business as usual. The pressures for transformation were there before the virus appeared. Rapid technological change, demographic change, progressive environmental degradation, rising concerns about mental health and threats to social cohesion, growing inequalities, persistent inequities, a fractured multilateral system, the need to rethink what human development means, and the changing relationships between citizens and their governments. COVID highlights all these pressures. It's shown how vulnerable we are between the explosive crisis of this pandemic and the equally rapid crisis of climate change. Every asset that we value, be it human, social, cultural, ecological, or biological, is at risk. Every domain of science contributes to our understanding. The real challenge is how to convert those understandings to meaningful change towards a favorable set of outcomes, better than those we currently face. The synthesis report and the associated papers reflect on a range of transformations that we believe are within reach. The primary challenge is how to take what we now know to find a path towards the collective action that is needed. How do we move nations to understand that collective actions will actually promote their interests far more effectively than nationalistic and individual action? This may sound utopian, but in my view, it's the fundamental challenge of the 21st century. So with that background, let me use some of the experiences with COVID over the past year to fuel discussion and put the IIASA project's conclusions in context. Surely the core obligation of all governments is to protect the assets of the organisation they are responsible for. In the case of governments, this includes human, social, cultural, environmental, and economic assets. The Sendai process and the associated framework agreement emphasise the need for the government to have proper risk assessment processes across the many domains of risk, from natural hazards to biological risk. Yet few countries do it systematically, and even where it is done, a large number of cognitive biases leads to risks often being diminished or ignored by the political process. COVID highlights this. Pandemic warnings had been loud and clear from the expert community, yet how few countries outside those that had experienced SARS had taken heed and were prepared. The proper use of science is critical in decision-making. But while that's easy to say, it has many nuances, and what does it really mean? Most countries do not have effective and structured ways of bringing science into public policy. Most had to resort to ad hoc processes to deal with the pandemic. It's been disappointing that as yet, the lessons from COVID are not extending to the broader aspects of scientific input into policy making. But ultimately, policy is never made on scientific advice alone. Quite properly, policy making must consider other values-based factors. Science communities must avoid hubris, and there's a delicate balance between brokerage, that is the transformation of what we know and what we don't know into policy, and the need for advocacy. And when an advocacy approach is taken by the scientific community, it must be based on robust evidence and analysis, not simply on our biases and an agenda. And we have another challenge. How often in the pandemic did we hear the politicians cynically proclaim, "We are just following the science"? Often they were using that statement to justify decisions which were clearly political, and ultimately such misuse of science will undermine trust in it. Political self-interest is the enemy of addressing the global commons. We saw that in play out in many ways during the pandemic. Firstly, in the early days of the pandemic, and how major actors acted, and how the WHO operated and made its decisions. Now we're seeing it play out in quite egregious decisions being made over vaccine distribution. The multilateral system is not healthy, and I will expand on this later in this talk. But science must also evolve to be more trusted, more systems-focused, and transdisciplinary. It must always work to be trustworthy. Disinformation and anti-scientism can severely undermine progress. Both were emerging long before COVID as real threats, whether by state or non-state actors. COVID has sadly catalyzed this linkage between science and political ideology and severely compromised progress on tackling the pandemic through its impacts on political and public decision-making. If I remove COVID from the title of this slide and replace it with climate change or biodiversity loss, or indeed any other aspect of the sustainability agenda, the list of challenges I have just mentioned does not change, nor do the actors. And the recommendations of the joint IIASA-ISE project again emphasize these same issues. We have a complex interplay between actors in addressing sustainability. Many people, including many scientists and governments, still silo their activities and thinking. The marine environment, SDG 14, is still thought about almost entirely separately from, say, SDG 3, human health. And it's that silo thinking that bedevils progress. Perhaps it's inevitable, given the complexity of the SDGs, which at least represented some attempt to get beyond siloed thinking by being holistic in their ambitions, that there'll be siloed thinking. But with 169 targets, some of which are very precise, and yet others rather utopian, and many in conflict with each other, they're perhaps overwhelming for policymakers. And this complexity of understanding has perhaps impeded progress. System thinking, as provided by IIASA in much of their work, and by ISC in the SDG interactions work they've done previously, is critical. It's thus not surprising that the Global Sustainability Development Report of 2019, the World in 2050 report, to which IIASA has contributed so much, and the synthesis report from the current project have all converged and point to the need for a much more integrated approach. One of the things, however, we do not do well in the policy community or in the science community is properly discuss trade-offs. Advocates for a particular action often think only about a singular action, but the consequences of any action nearly always have broader consequences. Addressing climate change requires trade-offs in the way lives are lived, economies flourish, and land is used. And actions are needed at every level of society, from individuals to governments. If we want their full understandings and engagement, then them understanding the system and understanding the trade-offs involved is critical. Getting action is far more than just simply finding a scientific or technical solution. Concepts such as co-design and post-normal science are critical. Behavioral sciences, the study of values, and understanding of biases and decision-making processes will be critical on the path ahead, whether we're dealing with communities or whether we're dealing with governments. I was pleased to see the OECD recently point to the importance of transdisciplinarity, both in policy and in research. Transdisciplinarity is quite distinct from multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, although sometimes we use these words badly. With transdisciplinarity, we're talking about two core characteristics: framing the question from the outset from multiple perspectives, and secondly, ensuring stakeholder engagement from the outset. Promoting transdisciplinarity in academia and in research is a challenge which must be addressed. In most institutions, the organization of academia is discipline-based, and research funding focuses on disciplinary excellence, not impact. Academic promotion is too often focused on bibliometrics, which in turn overwhelmingly favors disciplinary depth and not transdisciplinarity or impactful work. Finding ways to get beyond the 20th century science system is difficult, but we need transdisciplinary approaches to address the wicked problems. But such developments must not be at the expense of undermining disciplinary depth and excellence, which is also needed. Solutions to so many of the issues on the agenda require mission-focused activity by scientists and technologists across multiple disciplines, yet working together. Thus, the 21st century science system must support depth and detail at a disciplinary level, but also transversal integration of knowledge in ways that can impact the broader issues. Similarly, policy making in every country is remarkably siloed, and getting integrated thinking into public policy is a challenge in virtually every jurisdiction. Decisions and actions that will promote sustainability are made by governments, local authorities, businesses, and individuals. But time preferences push decision-making towards the short term rather than the long term. And this is particularly the case for politicians. Just today, or yesterday in New Zealand terms, my team published a report on why policymakers resist preparing for high impact risks. the risks that we're actually addressing when we think about the sustainability agenda. Fundamentally, we all have a set of biases that allow us collectively to underestimate future risks. Beyond these biases, there are real incentives in every political system that compound such resistance. Few countries use risk assessment well and systematically, and there's increasing commentary, including my own, on the role of accountability avoidance, of cognitive biases, and rational ignorance that lead to both policy and political resistance to evidence-informed risk analysis. We saw this in COVID, and we're seeing this in climate change. The IIASA reports strongly make points about science advice, which will be central to the overcoming some of these human and institutional issues. Few countries have systems that ensure the appropriate insertion of science into policy in the right time. Of course, science alone does not make policy. Ultimately, policy making is about making choices between different options, which are including the option of doing nothing. And those choices affect different stakeholders in different ways, with both predictable and unpredictable spillover effects. But what science can do is inform what the evidence base is, what the options are, and what are the implications of each option. It's for the policy community and the political community to consider the broader implications of each option, which range from affordability to diplomatic considerations, as well as public opinion. Science advice has multiple components to it and requires an ecosystem first of knowledge generators, such as universities and research centers. Second, it requires pluralistic evidence synthesis, and academies, national academies, can be well positioned to lead on this. But thirdly, there's the challenge of knowledge brokerage. That is the business of transmitting that evidence synthesis to the policymaker and the needs of the policymaker to the scientific community. This is a distinct set of skills from that of evidence synthesis. It requires an understanding of both the cultures and languages of science and of policy, and the skills of acting as a broker. The Anglophone countries, such as my own, use the concept of an advisor to the Prime Minister, ministers, and senior officials to ensure brokerage. Much of that interaction is informal to make sure the policymaker and the politician understands what the science is saying. This is not the process of a formal report alone. It's a form of diplomacy and relies on trust. There are obviously several other ways of ensuring both evidence synthesis and brokerage, but whatever the system that's developed, all countries need scientific advisory systems that function well, and as we have seen in COVID, many were caught short and have had to put in place ad hoc solutions. One of the big questions is, will the opportunity be taken to learn from these experiences and turn these ad hoc mechanisms into more permanent structures? Sadly, I see little evidence of this happening. If we look honestly at either COVID or climate change, the multilateral system has been less than fully effective. It's extraordinary that given the most immediate risk to humanity of the last 80 years has been on us for the last year, neither the United Nations General Assembly nor the Security Council has met at least once to discuss the pandemic and work to stop geostrategic and nationalistic interference in achieving optimal outcomes. And when we look at every aspect of the sustainability agenda, the politics of the global responses to climate change, marine degradation, biodiversity loss, and the many other dimensions where we need global cooperation, it's clear that the citizens of the world are being let down by the current multilateral processes. Is this the time to seriously rethink the multilateral system? As difficult as it may be, given we're in a very unstable multipolar world. The UN itself has no effective system of scientific input into its decision-making through its central agencies. although some of the UN family of agencies, particularly the technical agencies, have effective processes. But the mechanisms are very weak in the policy-oriented agencies. Groups such as the 10-member group to the Technology Facilitation Mechanism and the expert group that prepared the Global Sustainability Development Report have had but variable influence. The experimental and very transient Science Advisory Board to Secretary General failed for many reasons. It was not funded, it reported in Paris, not New York, and had no effective mandate and no funding. Yet science is critical to every issue the UN must consider. We need a new solution. My preference would be a formal engagement of the UN major group on science and technology to be converted into a brokerage system between the UN and the science community. But the key decisions made in the multilateral sphere are not made by scientists, they're made by diplomats. The importance of a closer relationship between science and diplomacy is clear. The term science diplomacy is often used without clarity as to what it means. It is much more than scientific cooperation across jurisdictional borders. It's about employing science to promote diplomatic goals. And just as policymakers have not understood the importance of science in every dimension that they face, so too generally diplomats have failed to understand how critical science advice and input is into enhancing their role. The matters we are discussing here involve recognizing that to address the issues of the global commons requires nation states to understand that avoiding a tragedy of the commons is in fact a form of enlightened self-interest for every country. I am pleased, however, to say that an increasing number of foreign ministries recognize the importance of science advice being embedded within their own organization. The United Kingdom, Japan, Netherlands, and the United States are among countries that now have science advisors within their foreign ministries, not just to promote the innovation economy, but to engage the very issues we are discussing. Some years ago, an informal grouping, the Foreign Ministers' Science and Technology Advisory Network, was formed under IIASA, the International Network for Government Science Advice, which I chair. It now has some over 30 or more countries involved, including Austria. It's been highly active over COVID, and such informal networks will become critically important, especially with such a fractured formal multilateral system. We face a number of potential existential threats, many encompassed within the reports being discussed today. To address each one of these, we need more effective partnerships between science, society, national and international policy communities. Risk assessment and management, more anticipatory policy making, transdisciplinary science, systems-focused science are all needed, and all need more engagement by the diplomatic community. I've not had time to consider the broader economic, social, and other dimensions covered in these reports, which raise important issues. They require both the science community and the policy community to reflect on why progress has been slow. My intent has been to highlight where some of the deeper roadblocks lie and how they might be removed. I hope that the deeper thinking and analysis that informed this series of reports can help lead to change. The role of IIASA in systems thinking and analysis is critical. And as President-elect of the ISC, I can confirm that the global scientific community is committed to ensuring our central role in addressing these issues and to promoting the engagement of the science community globally and nationally with both the diplomatic and policy communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Peter. Thank you very much. We seem to have lost Christian Corbel, but so I will continue the conversation on your behalf. Thank you for a very inspiring talk and exposition of some of the current thinking around these very important matters that have emerged out of the ISC and IIASA joint venture in this regard. For those of you that are not aware of it, tomorrow evening we have not tomorrow evening, that's correct, during the day tomorrow, Sir Peter will also be part of a panel that's going to be focusing on science diplomacy and systems analysis, where he will also be a guest speaker, and he'll be joined by the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, the second director of IIASA, and the grandson of the USSR Premier Kosygin, the person who negotiated with President Johnson about the creation of IIASA. This will probably be a very interesting session. So please, for those of you that are interested, look up the IIASA Regional Conference, which is on our website, and join us for that particular conversation around science diplomacy as well, in case you're not aware of those developments. So Peter, thank you very much for sharing with us. I will try and go through the questions and try and read them out to you, if you can try and deal with them. The first question was from Josef Sechner, if I pronounced that correctly, and he wanted to know which structural and organizational reforms are necessary to achieve some of these goals that you've mentioned. Is there anything in particular that comes to mind for you?
Well, I think one of the issues is the multilateral system still is seen as only national governments alone, that it doesn't include other stakeholders, business, civil society, and I think the scientific community / academia as well. And I think that limits its ability in many ways. So I think finding ways to change the operation of the major UN agencies would require thinking very much more about effective participation. It worries me, for instance, that there is the so-called UN Major Group on Science and Technology. All that effectively does is create an opportunity for 2 minutes to speak once at the General Assembly every year. It's not exactly real engagement of the scientific community in the thinking of the UN. I think there's that aspect to it. I think separately, there is a need to separate out what I would call the technical aspects of many of these issues from the political. If we're honest about what happened in the COVID pandemic at the WHO, the technical and the political got very rapidly conflated with each other. It would have been far healthier, and the work that I've been leading through IIASA, and I know the work that Helen Clark and Elizabeth Salief Johnson are leading through an independent panel, are both arguing that the technical side related to pandemic management needs to be separated fully, or effectively fully, from the political side. I think we could also argue that a lot of the problems around climate change related to the way in which the IPC ultimately conflates political and technical in ways that are not always helpful. So I think it may be utopian, but we need to do two things. We need a more inclusive way of discussing global problems, and we equally need to make sure that the evidence gets through to the decision-making process without first being corrupted by political interference. And they're both very difficult things to achieve, but can be achieved. I think we've seen at a national level in some countries some quite effective means of creating forms of scientific advice. I think we're seeing the emergence of new forms of deliberative and participatory democracy around the world. And I think it's bizarre that 80 years on from the inflection point that led to forming the United Nations, extreme nationalism stops us being willing to look at how we address the global commons through more effective mechanisms. I think that we're seeing, therefore, the role of track 2 organizations, and IIASA is one, the International Science Council is another, IIASA is another, and there are many others, where so much more is actually being achieved through the track 2 organizations rather than through the formal organizations that should.
Thank you very much. I'll step on to the next question, which was put forward by Augusto Maripazzi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who raised questions about how do we maximize the participation element of transdisciplinary engagement. She mentioned, I think it's a lady, mentioned some of the methods like foresight approaches and technologies that have been used, and I know they come with their own baggage, but maybe that's some thoughts from you along those lines about how do we ensure proper participation and stakeholder engagement in these kinds of conversations.
Well, I think it's got two components to it. First of all, transdisciplinary thinking requires multiple disciplines being engaged in framing the question itself. And often you can't separate the actual framing of the question from the research itself. It's a rather iterative process between the two. But I think the biggest enemy of transdisciplinary research is actually the academic system. We train people in silos. We promote people or give them tenure on the basis of nonsense metrics, bibliometric metrics, which favor individual disciplines. Research grant funding still hasn't worked out how to properly assess transdisciplinary research. So there's a whole lot of issues there that the science community needs to address, and the ISC will be picking this up in the next 2 or 3 years as an important issue to address. The second component of it is, of course, stakeholder engagement. And I think one of the things scientists are not necessarily very good at is stakeholder analysis. And I think a starting point is good stakeholder analysis, and then making sure, using whatever is the appropriate means in the context of the question at heart, that they're engaged from the outset. Extended peer review is a concept that some scientists find very difficult. And my experience, extended peer review, but where the stakeholders are part of the process, has been very valuable. And so there's no one, it's not a simple recipe, but it's a contextually specific recipe that has to be designed around the principles that are there. In terms of anticipatory policy, anticipatory framing, future thinking, well, they're all linked, aren't they? I mean, the boundary between what is systems analysis or system thinking and what is transdisciplinarity and what is foresighting is only a matter of the language that's used and perhaps some of the traditions that have grown up in each of those areas. I don't separate the three. In my center, we see foresighting, system thinking, and transdisciplinarity as all part of a common toolkit that gets applied to the question at hand. And so at the moment, one of the things that ISC is leading and I am chairing is an examination of how the COVID pandemic will play out, not just over 1 year, but over 2, 5, 7 years. Because if you think about the COVID pandemic, it has a biological clock, how the virus will evolve, how we'll fight the virus with vaccines and other means. It has a social clock, how will societies respond to the tragedies they've had, and in particular the impact of mental health. It's got an economic clock, what will be the long-term consequences of all the fiscal easing and quantitative easing that's occurred. It's got a political clock, because it's certainly changed the relationship between citizens and society, between business sector and governments and so forth. And it's got a geostrategic set of unknowns around it. Now, thinking through all of that cannot be achieved by discipline alone. It needs systems thinking, it needs foresighting, it needs transdisciplinary approaches. So they all come together if we're going to ask the one question that needs to be asked about COVID. What are the implications of decisions that governments make now or other actors make now that will make the pandemic more problematic? Clearly, there are decisions that will either be better or worse for the future. And so we need to use this combination of skill sets, this toolbox, appropriately to help answer those questions and point out that if we continue with extreme vaccine nationalism, for example, the pandemic will have longer-term consequences at a global level in many ways. This is probably my talk for tonight, Albert, so I'll stop on that now.
All right. Thank you, Peter. I think the next question that links directly to the point you just made is from Nachme Nasetusi, and he wants to know a little bit about, is it possible for us to think about these kinds of transformational changes without thinking about the democratic innovations that may be required within the context of nation states in terms of moving this collective multilateral decision making forward?
Well, I think that's one of the $64 trillion questions out there in many ways. I mean, there is no doubt that the arrival of social media and the internet changed potentially changed fundamentally the way in which citizens and their governments can interact. Now, in some governments that may have been used wisely, in other governments it's been used in more autocratic ways. I think one of the things that we've seen during COVID is even within the democracies, a tendency by governments, whether it be from the left or the right of the ideological spectrum, to enjoy the level of autocracy that COVID has brought, and it's spilled over into other aspects of their decision-making. You could argue that one of the threats of COVID has been, in a sense, to change that relationship between the citizen and state in a way that may not necessarily be healthy. On the other hand, as we know around the world, particularly in the West, in the liberal democracies, there's been experiments with citizens forum, citizens juries, hybrid forums, lots of other ways of engaging citizens. I think there's a long way to go to understand under what context those are trustworthy processes and in what ways they may not be. But I think if you underline that question with the fact that it clearly has to change, then the other part of the problem is, how do we deal with the disinformation pandemic? Because if public opinion or citizens' knowledge comes through systems which are manipulated willfully or not, then what you end up with is not with democracy, but with what Philip Kitcher, the philosopher, would call vulgar democracy, whereby then decisions are being made on grounds which are quite faulty. So this is a very tricky area where I think a lot more work is going to be needed by social scientists, by decision theorists, by many others, to find political scientists, to find how we can take the best of this new world and not turn it into something that may be actually worse. It's a very, very important question, but it's a hard question.
Right, so I think some of the questions that have been raised as well, and I'm just watching the clock, we've got another 5 minutes or so, focuses on the issues of building trust. I think that's inherent to the issue that you've just raised in that space. I don't know whether you have any comments about that.
Trust, transparency, and truth, if there's a word, truth, all come together. And I think that the science community really has to work to earn and keep its trustworthiness. And that's actually quite difficult. One of the reasons I'm concerned is because we've seen a clear loss of trust in other elites. We've seen a loss of trust in political elites. I think a loss of trust in business elites, certainly a loss of trust. And in many ways, science can be seen as elitist too. So I think we need to work very hard to maintain our trustworthiness. How do we do that? Is by being transparent, by engaging with the stakeholders, by thinking about the lessons from post-normal science, from the lessons of transdisciplinarity, engaging people, by being willing to be not confrontational with the policy community, but constructively honest with the policy community. As I said, I don't like it when politicians claim that they're doing what they're following the science, when in many cases it's been manifestly political. We need to call them out when they do that. It's trustworthiness is a hard concept, but it's also directly linked to something else, which is social cohesion. And social cohesion relies on vertical trust between citizens and the state, and horizontal trust between people within a state that have different worldviews. And of course, that's under threat, both vertically and horizontally across the world. And therefore, science needs to be a social science, psychological science. All the sciences need to really work hard to play their bit to be a trustworthy glue in this very unstable world.
And let me just add to that the importance of making sure that citizens become part of the scientific process. In other words, notions of citizen science and so on become really, really influential.
But I also think we've got to look to ourselves. If you look at the conduct of science, it doesn't necessarily stand up to its own ideals. 3 million papers a year, most of which are probably not valid in one way or the other, where we're competing for brownie points all the time in terms of citations and impact factors. I mean, we may need to look at the incentives that within the science system quite seriously and quite openly if we're going to maintain trust in science as being more than self-serving for the scientists that undertake the work.
Thank you very much for those valuable inputs. We've got 1 minute to go, so I'm going to ask my colleague Christian Kobel to maybe just give us some closing remarks or thoughts, at least from his side, at this particular point. Thank you, Sir Peter, for your input, but I'll leave it to Christian to thank you on our collective behalf. Thank you, Christian.
Well, thank you, Albert, and thank you very much, Sir Peter. I'm sorry that this time I had some technical difficulties and dropped out briefly. It took endlessly to get back on. But I would like to thank foremost Sir Peter for his really insightful comments, and all of you who have been listening in for joining us. I think this was extremely valuable interaction. And I think the lessons that we have been learning from the current crisis will be with us for quite some time. And all I can say is thank you, all of you. Thanks to IIASA for the technical help. Thanks, Sir Peter, for your wonderful talk. And thanks, Albert, for the great cooperation with the Academy. And thanks to everybody who's been listening, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Christian. Goodbye, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. So, Peter, have a nice day. Okay, all right, bye-bye.
Off to you one day soon, I hope.
Okay, bye-bye.